Osama bin Laden, a biography of terror, read and published by Mr. Books. In the tumultuous landscape of modern history, few names evoke as much dread and fascination as Osama bin Laden. His legacy is one deeply entwined with the violence, ideology and struggle that have shaped global events over the last half-century. This biography delves not only into the life of the man who orchestrated terror on an unprecedented scale, but also into the roots of the radical belief system that propelled his actions and defined his legacy. From the dusty streets of Riyadh to the mountains of Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden's journey was marked by contradictions, boundless wealth and austere piety, familial tradition and revolutionary zeal, inherited privilege and chosen exile. Emerging from a family whose name was synonymous with power and influence in the corridors of Saudi Arabia, bin Laden's transformation into the infamous leader of al-Qaeda demonstrates how personal convictions and formative experiences can catalyze historical shifts. Yet, understanding bin Laden is not merely an exercise in exploring the life of a terrorist mastermind. It is a probing study of the conditions that breed extremism. His early years, colored by religious instruction, exposure to political tumult, and the expectations of a prominent family, forged a worldview in which violence became a tool for seeking change. Gravitating towards radical circles and eventually fighting in the Soviet-Afghan War, bin Laden refined ideological convictions that would later underpin a global jihadist movement. This biography is divided into 8 comprehensive sections, each illuminating a distinct phase in bin Laden's evolution. It begins with his shadowy emergence from a wealthy dynasty and follows his journey through formative years steeped in ideological ferment. The narrative then plunges into the crucible of Afghanistan's war, where bin Laden tasted battle and forged alliances that would later coalesce into al-Qaeda. The subsequent chapters unravel the intricacies of this terrorist network, charting its rise to global infamy with the September 11th attacks, and conclude with bin Laden's final days, hunted and isolated, yet eerily influential. Throughout this book, the descriptive style aims to unveil the many layers of bin Laden's life, juxtaposing straightforward facts with nuanced analysis. The objective is not to sensationalize, but to dissect and understand the factors, social, political, religious, and psychological, that gave birth to one of history's most controversial figures. By tracing his journey, readers will confront uncomfortable realities about the nature of extremism, the allure of radical ideologies, and the volatile interplay between individual agency and world events. Osama bin Laden's story is one of descent into terror, a narrative that continues to echo in the global psyche. As you journey through these chapters, you will encounter not only the biography of a man, but the anatomy of an era shaped by violence, faith, and the relentless search for meaning in a chaotic world. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life. Now let's begin. Enjoy. Chapter 1, Roots of Extremism, Childhood and Family Legacy. Osama bin Muhammad bin Awad bin Laden was born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1957, into one of the most prominent and wealthy families in the kingdom. The bin Laden family was not merely a household, it was an institution, playing a crucial role in shaping the landscape of modern Saudi Arabia. Osama's father, Mohammed bin Laden, was a construction magnate who rose from humble Yemeni origins to become the favored contractor of the Saudi royal family. The bin Laden name became synonymous with success, influence, and a strict adherence to Wahhabi Islam. Osama was the 17th of Muhammad's 52 children, a fact that highlights the polygamous traditions and complex family dynamics inherent in many affluent Saudi households. The bin Laden residence was marked by luxury, but also by the demanding expectations of maintaining the family's reputation, a reputation built not just on economic power, but deeply intertwined with religious and cultural orthodoxy. This duality permeated Osama's early years, shaping both his sense of privilege and his awareness of responsibility. His mother, Hamida al-Attas, was of Syrian origin. Her presence in the bin Laden household was somewhat marginalized due to her ethnicity and her status as one of Mohammed's lower-ranked wives. Osama was raised in Jeddah after his father died in 1967, and it is here that the foundations of his character took hold. He lived in an environment characterized by piety and discipline, but complicated by the privileges of immense wealth. Much is said about Osama's childhood isolation. As a child, he was known to be quiet, introverted, and inclined towards religious introspection. Unlike many of his siblings who embraced Western lifestyles and business pursuits, Osama was marked by his conservatism and strict faith. He excelled in his Quranic studies and showed an early preference for religious texts over the material pleasures within his reach. He was educated at the prestigious Al-Qaeda Model School, a setting that further cultivated his commitment to Wahhabi principles. Family legacy weighed heavily on Osama. Within the bin Laden clan, adherence to Islamic orthodoxy was not merely a matter of personal faith, but a means of sustaining both social standing and political alliances. The family had close ties with the House of Saud, and it was an unstated expectation that its members uphold the ultra-conservative values that guided the kingdom's leadership. Osama internalized his role not simply as a son of privilege, but as a custodian of tradition. This responsibility soon translated into a rigid worldview. As bin Laden grew, the intersection of dynasty, religion, and politics became the foundation for his later extremism. The wealth and influence surrounding him did not dilute his faith. Rather, it served to affirm his sense of special purpose. He saw himself destined to defend Islam, as defined by the strict tenets of Wahhabism, against both internal corruption and external threat. Early signs of Iman melded with an increasing sense of mission. Osama's teachers and imams recognized his fervor and disciplined nature. He was respected for his piety, but also his solemn demeanor. This reputation allowed him to avoid the temptations that ensnared other affluent Saudi youth, further cementing his self-image as uniquely chosen. The tragic loss of his father at the age of 10 was a pivotal moment. Suddenly, Osama was thrust into a world without the stabilizing presence of the family patriarch. While the opulence persisted, the leadership role assumed by his older brothers created an atmosphere of competition and unease. Osama withdrew into religion, seeking solace in faith and forging a spiritual resilience that would later fuel his extremism. His mother remarried, further complicating family relationships. Osama occupied an ambiguous social position, privileged yet not fully embraced due to his mother's outsider status. This sense of being different magnified his yearning for significance and clarity, leading him to cleave ever closer to Islamic purity as both shield and sword. In sum, the roots of Osama bin Laden's extremism are found in his childhood and family legacy. The interplay of wealth and tradition, privilege and isolation, expectation and piety was the soil in which his radical vision would grow. These formative experiences did not produce extremism in every child of the bin Laden dynasty, but for Osama, they set the stage for a life driven by violence in pursuit of ideological certainty. Chapter 2: Wealth and Faith, Growing Up in the Bin Laden Dynasty. In the realm of Saudi Arabia's elite, the bin Laden family stood apart as architects of both physical and socio-political structures. Osama bin Laden's formative years were spent within this enclave of privilege, marked by both immense financial power and religious strictness. The bin Laden group's reputation for construction and entrepreneurship ensured not only economic dominance but also a complex web of connections with the royal family and leading clerics. The family fortune amassed by Mohammed bin Laden meant that Osama never knew financial hardship. Marble palaces, private tutors, and luxury cars were standard fixtures in his life. Yet the wealth came tethered to a demanding set of expectations. Every bin Laden child was groomed to preserve the family's distinction in business, society, and devotion to Wahhabi Islam, a doctrine that defined much of Saudi life. Osama's education was carefully orchestrated. He attended private schools where religious instruction was integrated with secular studies, but the emphasis was always on upholding wavering lines of faith. While his siblings oscillated between conservatism and Western indulgence, Osama had little inclination for secular distractions. Friends and teachers recall him as modest in dress and behavior, never drawn to the ostentation typical of Saudi youth with his resources. Within the household, rituals governed every aspect of life. Prayer times structured the day, and the Quran was central to Osama's education. He memorized verses with precision and developed a deepening sense of spiritual duty. The influence of Wahhabism reinforced a rigidity that set Osama apart, not only from his siblings, but even from others in his social sphere. He refrained from popular pastimes, favoring solitude and religious reflection. Despite, or perhaps because of, this disciplined lifestyle, Osama harbored a strong sense of purpose. From an early age, he was taught that the bin Laden name carried a responsibility to serve the Islamic world. This was not confined to charitable works, though the family was renowned for philanthropy within the kingdom. It extended to the defense and promotion of Islam on a broader scale. Osama's relationship with his siblings was complex. While some brothers and sisters pursued business interests in Europe and the United States, Osama became critical of what he saw as their drift towards modernity and secularism. He condemned their association with Western culture, regarding it as a betrayal of true Islamic values. This sense of moral superiority hardened over time, strengthening his resolve and isolating him further. At university, the King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Osama studied economics and business administration. More importantly, he came into contact with radical Islamic thinkers and activists who influenced his worldview. It was here that his wealth began to serve a dual function, ensuring access to power and facilitating involvement in burgeoning Islamist movements. His financial resources enabled him to support causes aligned with his increasingly radical views. Osama funded religious study groups, contributed to mosque construction, and sponsored scholars who advocated for puritanical forms of Islam. His philanthropic activities, while publicly lauded, often doubled as support for ideologies opposed to both Western influence and moderate Islam. Wealth also became a shield. Saudi authorities kept a watchful eye on the activities of prominent families. Yet the bin Laden dynasty's business importance granted Osama a degree of autonomy not afforded to common citizens. He traveled freely, met influential clerics, and associated with figures in underground Islamic networks, all under the cloak of family respectability. Faith and wealth were inseparable in Osama's mind. He believed that Islam sanctioned the use of resources for the advancement and protection of the faith. The bin Laden legacy, in his interpretation, was not purely economic but spiritual, a calling to lead and defend Islam. Over time, this translated into a willingness to finance ever more radical causes. As Osama matured, his critique expanded from personal lifestyle to politics. He saw the Saudi regime's relationship with the West, particularly the United States, as a direct affront to Islamic purity. The presence of foreign troops during the Gulf War would later crystallize his antagonism. But even in youth, Osama's distaste for foreign influence was pronounced. Thus, the bin Laden dynasty provided not only the material means for Osama's future actions, but also the ideological justification. His upbringing fostered a worldview in which wealth was a tool for religious struggle and piety was proof of leadership. This potent mixture prepared him to shift from quiet devotion to militant activism, a transition that would reverberate across the globe. Chapter 3: Early Influences, Religion, Politics and Radical Thought. Osama bin Laden's intellectual and spiritual development cannot be disentangled from the world he inhabited as a young man. Saudi Arabia, in the 1970s and 1980s, was a nation in flux, struggling to balance oil boom modernity with the centripetal force of religious orthodoxy. For Osama, these contradictions were opportunities. His early influences, drawn from religion, politics, and radical thought, would shape the philosophy that propelled his later actions. Within his family, formal Wahhabi doctrine dominated. Yet outside the home, Osama was exposed to a spectrum of religious and political ideas. At King Abdulaziz University, he met influential figures who would later become central to the emergence of transnational jihadism. Among these was Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian scholar whose advocacy for pan-Islamic struggle laid the intellectual groundwork for the Arab participation in the Afghan Jihad. Azzam championed the idea that Muslims worldwide ought to unite against infidel encroachment, linking religious obligation to militant resistance. Osama absorbed these teachings, finding resonance with his own sense of mission. Azzam's ability to connect scripture to activism impressed bin Laden, who began to see personal piety as inseparable from engagement in holy war. This doctrinal shift was crucial. The passive observance of faith gave way to the idea of active defense and eventual expansion. Politically, Osama's views were sharpened by the realities of Saudi governance. He despised the regime's alliances with the United States and saw its modernization drive as evidence of moral collapse. His writings from this period reflect a growing fixation on the corrupting influence of Western values and a belief that Islam faced a crisis from within as well as without. Osama also drew inspiration from the wider world of Islamic activism. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood provided a template for clandestine organization and ideological dissemination. Bin Laden admired their capacity for covert mobilization and their insistence on faith-based governance. His relationship with these movements was indirect but influential, providing both practical and theoretical models for his own ambitions. Radical thought blossomed in the environment surrounding the Afghan-Soviet conflict. News of resistance fighters, Mujahideen, struggling against the Red Army, reached Saudi Arabia, galvanizing young men across the region. Osama saw the Afghan Jihad as both a religious duty and a proving ground for Islamic Brotherhood. His involvement would begin with funding and organizing, but the allure of frontline combat beckoned. The convergence of religious duty and militant activism solidified in Osama's worldview. Scholars at his university stressed the importance of returning to pure Islam, while international events illustrated the necessity of defense. This period marked a transition from theoretical radicalism to practical engagement in global jihad. The idea of sacrifice, of wealth, status, and even life became central to Osama's philosophy. Osama's radicalization was not sudden. It was an accumulation of influences, crystallized by events that seemed to threaten Islam's integrity. He grew convinced that jihad was not only permissible, but imperative. This conviction found expression in speeches, writings, and organizational activities that laid the groundwork for future endeavors. The marriage of religious orthodoxy and militant radicalism distinguished Osama from other dissidents. He did not see violence as political rebellion alone, but as the fulfillment of divine obligation. His later statements often quoted Quranic verses and prophetic traditions to justify aggression, rooting terror in scriptural authority. Over time, Osama's thinking became increasingly absolutist. Dialogue with moderate Muslims gave way to denunciation, Western compromise was dismissed as treachery. The influence of radical preachers, underground pamphlets, and the escalating violence of Middle Eastern politics only deepened this posture. By the early 1980s, bin Laden had assembled around himself a group of ideologues and activists equally committed to the fusion of faith and combat. Thus, Osama's early influences set the direction for his life. The interplay of religion, politics, and radical thought provided the philosophical substrate for his later activities. He emerged from this crucible, convinced that the defense of Islam required militant action, a belief that would soon thrust him onto the world stage as a symbol of jihadism. Chapter 4. The Afghan Jihad. Bin Laden's baptism of fire. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a turning point in the narrative of Islamic resistance. For Osama bin Laden, the conflict was more than an international crisis. It was the crucible in which his radical convictions would be tested and solidified. The Afghan Jihad became the proving ground for bin Laden's theories of faith and violence. And it is here that he transitioned from ideologue to militant leader. Driven by the influence of Abdullah Azzam and other pan-Islamic scholars, bin Laden saw Afghanistan as the front line in a global struggle against the enemies of Islam. Mobilizing resources from his family's fortune, he organized networks to fund, equip, and train Arab volunteers seeking to join the Mujahideen. Soon, the narrative of Islamic Brotherhood fighting foreign occupation became irresistible, drawing recruits from across the Middle East and beyond. Osama's initial role was logistical and financial. He funded clinics, safe houses, and supply chains necessary for sustaining the insurgency. His organizational acumen made him a valuable asset, and soon he was recognized as a key figure among Arab fighters. Yet this background work was only the beginning. Osama was drawn to battlefield leadership, and by the mid-1980s, he moved to the front lines, embracing combat with conviction and zeal. His presence in Afghanistan transformed him. Witnessing the devastation wrought by Soviet military might, Osama's commitment deepened. The camaraderie among fighters, the rhetoric of martyrdom, and the hardships endured in conflict reinforced his belief in the sanctity of jihad. Bin Laden was not merely a financier, he became a symbol of sacrifice, earning the respect and loyalty of those around him. Personal involvement in fighting exposed Osama to both the brutality and necessity of violence. He suffered wounds, faced the loss of comrades, and saw firsthand the extent of suffering inflicted upon Muslim civilians. These experiences catalyzed his evolution from supporter to visionary, as he recognized the need for broader networks and more sophisticated strategies to sustain the jihadist cause. Throughout the Afghan conflict, Osama worked closely with Azzam and other Islamist leaders to develop the infrastructure for what would later become al-Qaeda. Training camps sprouted under his direction, and special units of Arab volunteers, known as the Afghan Arabs, conducted operations against Soviet forces. Bin Laden's charisma and organizational skill attracted ever-increasing numbers of militants. The ideological impact of the Afghan Jihad was immediate. Many fighters, including Osama, saw the defeat of the Red Army as proof of divine favor and the viability of armed struggle. The experience legitimized the use of violence for religious ends and provided the manpower, expertise, and networks necessary for future expansion. Osama emerged as a hero among jihadists, celebrated for both bravery and vision. The temporary alliances forged with Western powers during the conflict did little to temper Osama's growing mistrust of non-Muslim nations. While the United States and others provided material support to the Mujahideen, bin Laden internalized a deep suspicion of these backers, viewing their motives as self-serving and incompatible with Islamic purity. This ambivalence would later solidify into outright antagonism. The Afghan Jihad also had profound personal consequences for Osama. The hardships of war forged a sense of invulnerability while the adulation of peers and subordinates stoked his belief in a unique destiny. Bin Laden became convinced that jihad could and should be exported beyond Afghanistan, shifting from local defense to global offense. This conviction set the stage for the creation of a transnational network dedicated to perpetual struggle against perceived enemies of Islam. In summary, the Afghan Jihad was Osama bin Laden's baptism of fire. It transformed him from a wealthy Saudi activist to a militant icon, equipped with the leadership skills, ideological certainty, and international networks necessary for launching al-Qaeda. The lessons learned and bonds forged in Afghanistan reverberated through every subsequent act of terror, cementing bin Laden's legacy as the architect of violence. Chapter 5: Networks of Terror. Building al-Qaeda. The late 1980s marked a turning point for Osama bin Laden. The victory of the Mujahideen over Soviet forces in Afghanistan reinforced the idea that a dedicated, transnational network of militants could challenge global powers. Fueled by ambition, ideology, and organizational skill, bin Laden set out to structure such a network, one that evolved into the most notorious terrorist group of the modern era, al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's genesis was pragmatic as much as ideological. The return of seasoned fighters to their home countries posed both risks and opportunities. Bin Laden, together with other pioneering jihadists like Ayman al-Zawahiri, envisioned a disciplined, secretive organization dedicated not simply to regional conflict, but to a persistent campaign of global jihad. Unlike the decentralized cells of previous Islamist movements, al-Qaeda was conceived as a coordinated force, with robust command and control. The founding members were drawn from a select group of Afghan Arabs, volunteers who had demonstrated loyalty and capability in Afghanistan. These men shared bin Laden's conviction that jihad had no borders. The near enemy, local regimes, and far enemy, the West, particularly the United States, were equally legitimate targets. The network was thus structured to operate independently of nation-states, relying on ideological commitment and clandestine logistics. Financing al-Qaeda was enabled by bin Laden's remaining fortune, as well as donations funneled through sympathetic charities and private patrons. Extensive use of front organizations masked the flow of money, allowing al-Qaeda to develop training camps, forge identities, and plan increasingly sophisticated operations. The group invested heavily in recruitment, emphasizing religious indoctrination and operational discipline. Al-Qaeda's legal structure was fluid but hierarchical. Bin Laden was the unquestioned leader, with a consultative committee, Majlis al-Shura, guiding strategy and approving major actions. Subordinates, drawn from diverse backgrounds, received instruction in bomb-making, surveillance, and covert communication. The training regimen was harsh but effective, producing operatives capable of functioning in hostile environments worldwide. Communication was critical. Al-Qaeda established secure methods for exchanging intelligence, including encrypted messages, couriers, and coded broadcasts. Its reach extended from the Middle East and North Africa into Southeast Asia, Europe, and North America, a network built to withstand counterterrorism efforts and adapt as circumstances demanded. Ideology remained the lifeblood of al-Qaeda, binding disparate members to a singular vision of perpetual struggle. Bin Laden's sermons, videos, and writings provided the doctrinal framework, portraying the network as the vanguard of a new global Islamic order. Loyalty to the group was secured through the promise of martyrdom and the appeal of ideological purity. Al-Qaeda was also pragmatic in its approach to alliances. Bin Laden forged links with other militant groups, including Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and factions in Chechnya and Kashmir. These partnerships expanded operational reach, while solidifying al-Qaeda's status as the nucleus of international jihadism. As the 1990s progressed, al-Qaeda's infrastructure matured. Cells were dispatched to various continents, charged with reconnaissance, recruitment, and preparation for attacks. The network showed remarkable resilience, surviving state crackdowns and internal dissension. Its reputation, fueled by successful operations, attracted new generations of militants eager to join the fight. In sum, Osama bin Laden's greatest innovation was the creation of a sustainable, international network capable of projecting terror. The structure, funding, and ideological coherence of al-Qaeda marked a departure from earlier decentralized movements. Bin Laden's ability to unite disparate elements under a common cause transformed Jihad from a local struggle into a global menace. Chapter 6: Ideology of Violence, the Birth of Global Jihad. Osama bin Laden's journey to infamy began not with acts of violence, but with the cultivation of an ideology that promised to reshape the world order. Born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1957, bin Laden was the 17th child of Mohammed bin Laden, a billionaire construction magnate, and Hamida al-Attas, his 10th wife. Raised alongside dozens of siblings, Osama basked in privilege, but the seeds of disquiet were sown early. His education at elite schools in Jeddah and later at King Abdulaziz University exposed him to an environment where religious piety intersected with burgeoning pan-Islamic fervor. The young bin Laden was profoundly shaped by the teachings of religious scholars and the political events of the era. The 1967 Six-Day War, the rise of secular dictators in the Arab world, and the growing presence of Western culture stoked a sense of grievance. Bin Laden gravitated toward the ideology of Salafism, a purist branch of Sunni Islam that advocated a return to the practices of the pious ancestors. Salafism was uncompromising in its opposition to secular governments, Western influence, and perceived un-Islamic innovations. The real turning point came with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The conflict became a crucible for aspiring jihadists, drawing fighters from across the Islamic world. Bin Laden, deeply moved by reports of Muslim suffering and energized by calls for holy war, traveled to Pakistan to join the cause. In the rugged borderlands, he established himself as an organizer, raising funds, recruiting volunteers, and eventually setting up the Maktab al-Khidamat, an office for coordinating aid to Mujahideen fighters. His experiences in Afghanistan were transformative. Bin Laden witnessed firsthand the power of violent struggle, but also the limits of mere resistance. He came to believe that jihad was not merely a local or regional affair, but a global imperative. The West, particularly the United States, became the symbol of all that threatened the purity and independence of Islamic societies. Bin Laden crafted a narrative of cosmic conflict, pitting true believers against a sprawling alliance of infidels, apostates, and oppressors. This ideology was articulated in countless speeches, writings, and videos. Bin Laden invoked Quranic verses and historical precedents to justify violence as both defensive and offensive. He denounced corrupt Arab regimes as puppets of the West and decried the suffering of Muslims in Palestine, Chechnya, Bosnia, and elsewhere as evidence of a global anti-Islamic conspiracy. The concept of martyrdom became central, a path of sacrifice for the sake of Ummah, the global Muslim community. The blend of ideology and action led to the creation of al-Qaeda in 1988. Al-Qaeda was designed as a network, not a conventional organization. Its purpose was to catalyze jihad worldwide, transcend borders, and challenge the legitimacy of existing states. Bin Laden's message was uncompromising. Victory lay in unwavering faith, willingness to die, and persistent struggle against overwhelming odds. Bin Laden's personal charisma and organizational acumen attracted a cohort of followers, many battle-hardened veterans of Afghanistan. He disseminated texts espousing takfir, the denunciation of fellow Muslims as apostates, and called on Muslims everywhere to rise up. Al-Qaeda's training camps became crucibles of radicalization, instilling ideological discipline and practical skills in explosives, guerrilla warfare, and espionage. Throughout the 1990s, bin Laden refined his ideology, responding to events such as the Gulf War and the presence of US troops in Saudi Arabia. He saw these developments as evidence of a new colonialism, prompting fatwas that called for strikes against American interests globally. His rhetoric evolved from local grievances to a vision of global jihad, uniting disparate movements under the banner of relentless struggle. The birth of global jihad was more than an expression of violence. It was the formulation of a worldview that made terror a sacred duty. Bin Laden's ideology remains influential, spawning countless offshoots and imitators. Understanding this evolution is crucial, not only for tracing the roots of al-Qaeda, but for comprehending the enduring appeal of violent extremism. Chapter 7. From Enemy to Target. The US as the Great Satan, one of Osama bin Laden's most significant ideological shifts, was his identification of the United States as the central enemy, the Great Satan. This transformation did not occur overnight. It was shaped by historical events, personal experiences, and strategic calculations. In the early days of the Afghan Jihad, the United States was a tacit ally. American financial and military support helped arm the Mujahideen and ultimately aided in the Soviet withdrawal. Bin Laden himself benefited indirectly from this support. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent shift in global power dynamics reframed the narrative. No longer allies by proxy, the United States became the principal power dictating terms in the Middle East and beyond. The roots of bin Laden's animosity lay first in American foreign policy. The unwavering US support for Israel was a pivotal factor, fueling resentment throughout the Arab world. For bin Laden, the plight of Palestinians was not simply a local issue. It was emblematic of a global struggle against injustice inflicted by Western powers. The 1990-91 Gulf War further hardened bin Laden's stance. The arrival of American troops in Saudi Arabia, home to Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, was seen as an abomination. Bin Laden argued that only God's law should reign on holy soil, and the presence of non-Muslim armies was a direct violation. His appeals to the Saudi regime were ignored, triggering confrontations that led to his eventual exile and growing radicalization. In Sudan, where bin Laden settled in the mid-1990s, his worldview crystallized. The United States was no longer just a symbol of Western decadence, but an active enemy ensconced in military bases, embassies, and corporate investments throughout the Muslim world. Bin Laden posited that American influence undermined Islamic governance, corrupted youth, and perpetuated authoritarian rule through puppet regimes. His rhetoric became increasingly virulent. Fatwas issued in 1996 and 1998 explicitly called for attacks on American military and civilian targets. More than a declaration, these fatwas served as ideological manifestos, rallying al-Qaeda and affiliated groups to action. Bin Laden portrayed the United States as spiritually bankrupt, culturally imperialist, and militarily oppressive. The phrase "Great Satan," borrowed from Iranian revolutionary discourse, took on new meaning within bin Laden's lexicon. The US was condemned for its materialism, permissiveness, and perceived moral decay. Bin Laden's denunciations resonated among those disillusioned by failed secular revolutions and frustrated by poverty, repression, and marginalization across the Muslim world. Bin Laden's strategy was not merely rhetorical. He understood that attacking US interests would draw attention to his cause, galvanize recruits, and provoke reactions that might further destabilize the region. The embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, 1998, and the attack on the USS Cole, 2000, were calculated strikes intended to demonstrate al-Qaeda's reach and resolve the escalation of violence. and rhetoric culminated in the planning for 9/11. Bin Laden envisioned an act so audacious that it would force the United States into open confrontation. He believed that American retaliation would expose the fragility of its alliances, hasten its decline, and inspire Muslims to the righteous path of jihad. Throughout these developments, bin Laden blended theological justification with political pragmatism. He quoted sacred texts, but also referenced historical grievances and contemporary injustices. The enemy, in his vision, was not only the US government, but the broader edifice of Western power. Bin Laden's efforts to demonize the United States served multiple purposes: rallying support, legitimizing violence, and crafting a narrative of existential struggle. He tapped into widespread anger, channeling it into a coherent ideology that justified terrorism as both resistance and revenge. The transformation of the US from distant adversary to central target marked a pivotal shift in the tactics and scope of global jihad. It provided al-Qaeda with focus, urgency, and a cause célèbre, reshaping not only the organization's objectives, but also the broader contours of militant Islamism. Chapter 8. The Road to Infamy. Attacks of the 1990s. Osama bin Laden's transition from ideologue to international pariah was catalyzed by a string of violent attacks in the 1990s. These actions signaled the maturation of al-Qaeda, moving beyond rhetoric and recruitment into operational terror with global consequences. The first major attack attributed to bin Laden occurred in 1992, when two hotels in Aden, Yemen, frequented by American troops en route to Somalia, were bombed. Though the result was less lethal than intended, it marked the beginning of direct assaults on US interests. Bin Laden, frustrated by the perceived passivity of Muslim governments, decided that spectacular violence against Americans would awaken defenders of Islam. Al-Qaeda's tactics evolved rapidly. Training camps in Afghanistan and Sudan churned out operatives versed in explosives, small arms, and intelligence gathering. Bin Laden maintained a deliberate separation from frontline activities, focusing instead on funding, logistics, and ideological direction. His charisma attracted not only fighters, but strategists, men like Ayman al-Zawahiri, who helped refine the group's objectives and methods. The bombings of US embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in August 1998 were watershed moments. Coordinated attacks killed over 200 people and injured thousands, demonstrating al-Qaeda's capacity for simultaneous, high-casualty operations. These attacks were meticulously planned. Scouts surveyed sites, bomb makers constructed devices, and operatives blended unobtrusively into local communities. The carnage shocked the world, putting bin Laden squarely on the radar of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The embassy bombings were followed by increased scrutiny from the United States. President Bill Clinton ordered missile strikes on suspected al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan and Sudan. But bin Laden was already moving deeper into the shadows. The attacks emboldened al-Qaeda's rank and file, solidifying bin Laden's reputation as the architect of jihad. In October 2000, the USS Cole, a US Navy destroyer refueling in Yemen, was targeted by suicide bombers piloting a small boat laden with explosives. The blast ripped through the ship's hull, killing 17 sailors and injuring dozens more. The meticulous planning required for such an operation showcased al-Qaeda's growing sophistication. Recruitment manuals, propaganda videos, and coded messages facilitated coordination. Even as bin Laden's own movements became more secretive, less publicized, but equally significant, were attacks in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and elsewhere designed to destabilize local regimes and international interests. Bin Laden's approach was relentless: strike, provoke a response, and expand the theater of war. Each incident was accompanied by statements framing the violence as righteous retribution for American aggression in Muslim lands. Bin Laden's tactics reflected both ideological intent and strategic calculation. By targeting US installations, he aimed to provoke military retaliation, which he believed would further radicalize Muslim populations. He bet that a cycle of violence would expose American vulnerabilities and sow discord among its allies. Al-Qaeda's reach extended beyond the Middle East. Operatives established cells in Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia, planning attacks, recruiting members, and raising funds through charities, businesses, and criminal enterprises. Bin Laden encouraged decentralization, giving affiliates autonomy to select targets and methods. This flexibility made al-Qaeda difficult to suppress as local grievances and opportunities drove operations. The 1990s saw bin Laden transformed into a global celebrity and outlaw. Western media, intelligence agencies, and governments struggled to grasp the scale and ambition of his movement. His statements became more pointed, threatening new atrocities if the US did not withdraw from Muslim lands and cease its support for Israel. Each act of terror deepened bin Laden's notoriety. He leveraged media coverage, using interviews and videos to articulate demands and project defiance. The attacks of the 1990s were not isolated events, but part of a sustained campaign, laying the groundwork for even more devastating operations to come. The road to infamy was paved with blood, rhetoric, and relentless conviction. Bin Laden's vision of global jihad found expression not only in words, but in the spectacle of violence. Violence meant to shock, provoke, and alter the trajectory of history. Chapter 9, 9/11, the day the world changed, the September 11th, 2001. Attacks are indelibly etched into global memory, not simply as acts of violence, but as the threshold of a new era. Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda engineered a catastrophe that toppled icons of American power, reshaped geopolitics, and redefined the scale and scope of terrorism. Planning for 9/11 began in earnest in the late 1990s. Bin Laden and his inner circle sought an operation that would dwarf previous attacks, both in scale and impact. The selection of targets was deliberate. The World Trade Center, symbolizing economic dominance. The Pentagon, representing military might. And intended the US Capitol or White House as the seat of government. These targets reflected bin Laden's formulation of jihad as a direct assault on Western civilization. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the chief architect of the plot, worked closely with bin Laden to recruit the muscle hijackers, operatives trained in the camps of Afghanistan. Preparation involved years of clandestine activity, including pilot lessons in the United States, detailed surveillance, and the careful acquisition of documents and funding. The conspirators lived quietly in American suburbs, blending in while awaiting the signal. On the morning of September 11th, 4 teams executed bin Laden's vision. 19 hijackers seized control of 4 commercial airliners, methodically subduing crews and passengers. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower, triggering a firestorm and mass panic. Within the hour, American Airlines Flight 77 plummeted into the Pentagon, while United Airlines Flight 93, wrested from hijackers by brave passengers, crashed into a Pennsylvania field, missing its target but cementing defiance. The immediate impact was catastrophic. Nearly 3,000 killed, thousands injured, trillions in property and economic loss. The Twin Towers collapse broadcast worldwide horror and helplessness. First responders, families, and city dwellers faced chaos, uncertainty, and grief. The attacks triggered global shockwaves, paralyzing financial markets and precipitating an unprecedented security overhaul. Bin Laden's intent was not merely destruction. He sought to provoke the United States into expansive retaliation, believing that costly wars would drain resources, breed resentment, and expose vulnerabilities. In subsequent video messages, he celebrated the attacks as divine justice for American deeds abroad and mocked the vaunted strength of Western institutions. The ramifications of 9/11 were immediate and far-reaching. The United States, under President George W. Bush, declared a war on terror. Afghanistan was invaded weeks after the attacks, targeting the Taliban regime and al-Qaeda bases. Security apparatuses worldwide were overhauled. Border controls tightened, surveillance increased, and new policies enacted to combat transnational terror. 9/11 fractured the illusion of safety that had prevailed in the West. It exposed the porousness of borders and the complexity of combating non-state actors. Bin Laden's innovation lay not only in the method, using commercial aircraft as weapons, but in targeting symbols of American hegemony. The psychological impact was profound. Fear and uncertainty became global phenomena, affecting travel, commerce, and daily life. Islamophobia surged, affecting millions uninvolved in terrorism. Bin Laden's aspiration, polarization between Muslims and non-Muslims, was partially realized, with toxic political discourse echoing in public debates and international policies. For al-Qaeda, 9/11 was both a triumph and a turning point. The organization achieved its aim of forcing open confrontation, but at significant cost. Many operatives were captured or killed, infrastructures dismantled, and support networks disrupted. Bin Laden went into hiding, his voice resonating primarily through recorded messages and intermediaries. The day the world changed, Bin Laden proved the potency of ideology, organization, and spectacle. The fallout would shape wars, alliances, and societal attitudes for decades. The attacks left a scar, but they also galvanized an enduring resolve to confront terror and its underlying causes. Chapter 10. The Mastermind, Planning and Execution of Terror. Osama. Bin Laden's status as the mastermind of modern terrorism was cemented through his role in orchestrating attacks that combined ideological fervor with meticulous planning and ruthless execution. His leadership style and strategic approach to terror transformed al-Qaeda into a sophisticated, agile, and deadly organization. Bin Laden's genius lay in synthesis, blending charisma, ideological clarity, and operational discipline. He surrounded himself with advisors who were as committed to global jihad as he was, delegating responsibilities for logistics, recruitment, and propaganda. The training camps in Afghanistan operated as factories of militant skill building, producing operatives capable of complex, high-profile attacks. Planning often began years in advance. Bin Laden's inner circle analyzed vulnerabilities, mapped targets, and experimented with tactics. Technological innovation was prized, bomb-making, cryptography, intelligence gathering, coupled with unwavering secrecy. The 9/11 plot, for example, relied on hundreds of minor details, from money wiring through legitimate banks to the acquisition of false documents and the artful embedding of operatives in everyday life. Execution was predicated on discipline and fanaticism. Recruits were indoctrinated through lectures, Quranic study, and psychological conditioning. Martyrdom, celebrated in camps and videos, became a badge of honor. Bin Laden's narrative conflated personal sacrifice with eternal reward, fostering a culture where operatives viewed death as a passage to glory. The chain of command was fluid, yet rigorous. Bin Laden conducted regular meetings with deputies, scrutinized operational reports, and issued directives. He encouraged improvisation, demanding initiative from regional cells. While al-Qaeda maintained a central leadership, autonomy was granted to local affiliates to maximize operational agility. Security was paramount. Bin Laden's movements were shrouded in secrecy, protected by loyal bodyguards, shielded by sympathetic tribal leaders, and hidden in labyrinthine networks of safe houses. Communications relied on couriers, coded messages, and encrypted devices. The use of analog radios, satellite phones, and clandestine internet posts reflected adaptability in the face of relentless pursuit. Bin Laden's mastery extended to psychological warfare. Every attack was meant not only to cause destruction, but to send a message. Symbolic targets amplified terror. Spectacular violence attracted attention. Statements released after attacks justified killings, warned of future strikes, and sowed confusion among enemies. Video recordings, complete with Quranic references and rhetorical flourish, were carefully distributed to maximize media impact. Al-Qaeda's operational record was not without setbacks. Arrests, infiltrations, and failed plots resulted in organizational losses. However, bin Laden's persistence and adaptability ensured continuity. Training camps relocated, funding sources diversified, and alliances formed with groups like the Taliban, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and networks in Southeast Asia. One of bin Laden's key innovations was the decentralization of terror. He issued general directives, leaving tactics and timing to autonomous cells. This structure confounded intelligence agencies, allowing al-Qaeda to operate in disparate environments and launch attacks with minimal central coordination. The planning and execution of terror under bin Laden was marked by a blend of pragmatism and dogmatic zeal. He valued efficiency, but sacrificed nothing of ideological purity. While spectacular attacks drew headlines, smaller operations chipped away at enemies' willpower, resources, and sense of control. Bin Laden's transformation into the mastermind of terror reflected not only his own skills, but the collective efforts of a network of operatives who shared his vision, discipline, and relentless appetite for violence. Understanding the anatomy of bin Laden's strategy is essential for grasping the mechanics and persistence of modern terror networks. Chapter 11: Global Fallout, Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The septic wound of September 11, 2001 did not merely scar American soil. Its infection spread rapidly, festering across borders and precipitating an era of war. The global fallout that ensued became the prologue of a new world order, one increasingly defined by uncertainty, suspicion, and the omnipresence of violence. Osama bin Laden, through a network meticulously crafted and ruthlessly maintained, became the catalyst for wars that would redraw maps, topple regimes, and destabilize entire regions. The immediate aftermath of 9/11 saw an international consensus coalesce around the need for action. The Taliban government in Afghanistan, which had provided bin Laden and his al-Qaeda operative sanctuary, became the first target. The United States, backed by a coalition of allies, launched Operation Enduring Freedom in October 2001. The war's opening salvos were decisive, stripping the Taliban of formal power and scattering al-Qaeda's core leadership. However, the sense of victory was quickly tempered by reality. Afghanistan's rugged terrain and tribal complexities resisted occupation, and bin Laden's network slipped into the shadows. Adapting and surviving amid the chaos, Afghanistan's transformation into a battleground was not just physical. The psychological and political landscapes were irrevocably altered. The new Afghan government, propped up by international aid and military presence, fought constant insurgency. The local populace bore the brunt, enduring drone strikes, street battles, and the perennial fear of reprisal from militants. Cities were reduced to rubble, rural areas filled with terror, while foreign forces faced mounting casualties and diminishing public support. Bin Laden's objective was not simply to destroy, it was to provoke, to entangle adversaries in wars of attrition that drained resources and morale. As the conflict in Afghanistan smoldered, the specter of bin Laden was invoked to justify a second war, Iraq. Despite tenuous and ultimately disproved links between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, the fear triggered by 9/11 was leveraged to initiate Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. The American-led invasion deposed Hussein in weeks, but the occupation unleashed a vortex of violence, sectarian strife, insurgency, and the birth of new extremist factions became the order of the day. Bin Laden, though absent physically, was omnipresent in ideology. A shadow moving among bombed markets and shattered cities, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are intertwined, their repercussions bleeding across borders. Refugee crises destabilized neighboring nations. Recruitment for extremist groups surged amid the devastation. Western countries grappled with domestic terrorism, struggling to reconcile civil liberties with security demands. Intelligence networks expanded, budgets ballooned. Yet the original target, bin Laden, remained elusive. His myth growing in the collective fear of the world. A critical legacy of these wars was the normalization of a perpetual state of conflict. Bin Laden's vision, predicated on the belief in Western overreach and imperial hubris, found vindication in scenes of prolonged military occupation, civilian casualties, and endless reprisals. The wars were not merely responses, but in part, fulfillments of bin Laden's ideological strategy to force adversaries into costly and unpopular engagements and thus mobilize new waves of radicalization. As the chapter closes, the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq remain haunted by bin Laden's ghost. The fallout from his orchestrated terror is not confined to body counts or trashed cities. It lives in policies, fractured societies, and the persistent churn of violence from which escapes are few and fragile. Bin Laden, from his hidden sanctuaries, could claim victories not in territory, but in the enduring chaos he left behind. A chaos that continues to shape the geopolitics of the world. Chapter 12. Life in Hiding. From Tora Bora to Safe Houses. The collapse of the Taliban regime in late 2001 marked the start of Osama bin Laden's most secretive and elusive years. From mountain strongholds to shadowy urban enclaves, bin Laden's journey underground is a tale of survival, ingenuity, and constant fear. His life in hiding would become legend, the template for fugitives and the bane of intelligence operatives worldwide. The mountains of Tora Bora in eastern Afghanistan became bin Laden's first sanctuary. Here, in a network of fortified caves carved deep into rugged terrain, bin Laden and his core followers sought refuge from the relentless assault of American-led forces. The harsh winter, treacherous passes, and labyrinthine tunnels made pursuit nearly impossible. Local warlords and loyal fighters, some bribed, others ideologically devoted, shielded him, complicating the efforts of Delta Force teams, CIA assets, and Afghan allies. Tora Bora was more than a physical hideout. It was a symbol of bin Laden's resilience and cunning. Despite the grinding pressure and constant bombardment, bin Laden orchestrated his escape, slipping away before American troops could close the net. Intelligence failures and slow mobilization would haunt Western agencies for years. The mountain redoubt faded into legend, fueling both his own mythos and the frustration of those who hunted him. Following the Tora Bora escape, bin Laden's existence became even more shadowy. He retreated into the tribal areas of Pakistan, an archipelago of safe houses strung across the northwest frontier province and South Waziristan. Here, bin Laden became a master of concealment. He adapted his movements to the rhythms of local life, never staying too long in one place and relying on trusted intermediaries and deep familial loyalties. He disguised communication, used couriers instead of electronic devices, and maintained isolation even from his closest associates. The nature of bin Laden's living conditions was both austere and precarious. Accounts from later captured aides reveal a man cut off from the world, subsisting on basic rations and living under perpetual threat. He was said to be restless, reading, writing, and issuing messages to sustain al-Qaeda's momentum. Bin Laden's family, wives, children, and loyal bodyguards were often with him, forging a caravan of survival in hostile territories. Yet paranoia and prudence shaped every routine. Bin Laden rarely ventured outside, limiting exposure to satellites or informants. Safe house security was paramount. Thick walls, covered windows, self-imposed isolation. Movement was reserved for nights or rare emergencies. Financial support came in secret transfers, while medical emergencies were gambled against the risk of exposure. The psychological toll on bin Laden and his entourage was immense, a life dominated by anxiety, tension, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. Despite these hardships, bin Laden remained active. His hideouts were centers of propaganda production. Handwritten missives, audio tapes, and eventually digital videos were created and smuggled out to ignite global followers. His presence, unseen but felt, remained a constant source of inspiration and defiance among extremists and a relentless frustration to his pursuers. Bin Laden's years in hiding redefined the concept of fugitive warfare. He survived by leveraging loyalty, exploiting geography, and adapting constantly to his circumstances. The Pakistani intelligence services, always entangled in a web of local alliances and international pressures, failed or refused to find him, further fueling speculation and conspiracy. Meanwhile, Western intelligence and military assets poured billions into the search. Their success measured only in glimpses and rumors. His ultimate escape to Abbottabad, a quiet military town, epitomized his genius for hiding. By selecting an urban environment, bin Laden upended expectations. His compound, surrounded by high walls yet conspicuously low on electronic communications, offered both security and seclusion. Neighbors noted strange habits, children saw little of the outside world, and the compound's design raised suspicions only in retrospect. Bin Laden's survival, year after year, became a challenge not just to his enemies, but to the very systems constructed to defeat him. It was a game of patience, cunning, and ultimately fate, a chapter that redefined global manhunts and continues to inspire both awe and horror. Chapter 13. The propaganda machine, speeches, videos, and messages. Osama bin Laden understood early on that the true power of terror was psychological. Bombs and gunfire could kill. Words could mobilize millions. Through a masterful use of media and propaganda, bin Laden transformed himself from a fugitive into a global icon, his every message resonating far beyond the bunkers and safe houses where he recorded them. The propaganda machine was al-Qaeda's beating heart. From the caves of Afghanistan to the secret rooms of urban compounds, bin Laden and his lieutenants crafted a continuous stream of content designed to educate, incite, and recruit. These ranged from formal speeches and audio recordings to grainy videos disseminated via satellite channels and, later, the internet. The messaging was multilingual, targeting not only Arabic-speaking followers, but also sympathizers across Africa, Asia, and the West. Central to bin Laden's propaganda was the image of resistance. He painted himself as the defender of Islam against Western aggression, invoking historical analogies and religious rhetoric. His speeches mixed Quranic verses with references to contemporary events: the invasion of Afghanistan, the occupation of Iraq, drone strikes, and civilian casualties. Each message was designed to offer justification, to frame acts of terrorism as defensive maneuvers against overwhelming odds. The style was deliberate. Bin Laden was never flamboyant in delivery. His tone was calm, his words measured, often delivered from austere backgrounds. This visual modesty generated credibility and empathy among viewers. The Sheikh in exile, soft-spoken yet resolute, became a template for jihadist leaders to follow. Even as Western media depicted him as cartoonish evil, his broadcasts presented him as thoughtful, even pious, a veneer that allowed him to manipulate hearts and minds with ease. Al-Qaeda's media arm, as-Sahab, became highly sophisticated in production and distribution. Edited videos included footage of martyrdom operations, messages from other leaders, and tactical advice. Bin Laden's instructions were carefully coded to avoid interception, sometimes released in conjunction with significant attacks to maximize psychological impact. The use of digital technology expanded al-Qaeda's reach, allowing messages to leap national borders and appear in global news cycles within hours. Bin Laden's propaganda campaign was not monolithic. It adapted to circumstances, responding to evolving contexts, military setbacks, leadership changes, and global reactions. At times, bin Laden appeared conciliatory, offering conditional truces. At others, he threatened devastation. This unpredictability kept adversaries guessing, while his followers remained galvanized by each new call to action. The recruitment impact was profound. Young men across the Middle East, Africa, and even Western countries answered his calls, lured by the promise of martyrdom, adventure, or ideological purpose. Each message contributed to a collective consciousness, the sense of belonging to a global movement engaged in existential struggle. Bin Laden's image became inseparable from the concept of jihad, blurring distinctions between legitimate resistance and blind fanaticism. Western response to bin Laden's propaganda was ambivalent and often reactive. Intelligence agencies developed sophisticated analyses to decipher meaning, profile audiences, and counteract influence. Yet the viral nature of bin Laden's messaging often outpaced official efforts. Attempts at censorship were circumvented. Counter-programming sometimes backfired, reinforcing bin Laden's narrative of victimization. In the later years, bin Laden's communication became more difficult. Increased surveillance, danger of detection, and the need for secrecy forced reliance on couriers and sporadic releases. Yet each message, sometimes delayed by months, continued to make headlines, a testament to the power of the myth bin Laden had meticulously constructed. In the digital age, bin Laden's propaganda machine set the standard for extremist messaging. Its legacy persists in jihadist media, echoing across new platforms. The war of words proved as dangerous and enduring as any conflict of arms. Bin Laden forever changed the way terror is broadcast to the world. Chapter 14. Followers and fanatics, the spread of al-Qaeda's reach. The seeds planted by Osama bin Laden matured into an expansive network, one whose roots extended far beyond the deserts of Afghanistan. The phenomenon of global jihadism, catalyzed by bin Laden's charisma and ideology, birthed an array of movements, each linked by common cause but frequently divergent in culture, goals, and tactics. Bin Laden was not merely a leader. He presided over a cult of personality that shaped the destinies of fanatics and forced governments to confront threats both at home and abroad. Al-Qaeda's organizational model was both hierarchical and decentralized. At the core were bin Laden's tight-knit associates, many drawn from veteran fighters of the anti-Soviet war. Surrounding them were waves of recruits, exiles, ideologues, disenfranchised youth, fueled by a potent mix of religious fervor and political grievance. The network grew through informal channels, leveraging family bonds, tribal alliances, and shared experience in training camps. The spread of al-Qaeda was unique in its adaptability. Bin Laden's vision for global jihad was not constrained by geography or nationality. Cells appeared in Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, and even North America. Each cluster drew from local discontent, tailoring operations to terrain and opportunity. The bombings of embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, the attacks in Madrid and London, and countless other plots underscored al-Qaeda's ability to modularize terror, combining local grievances with global strategy. Followers of bin Laden were bound by ideological loyalty, but fanaticism often flourished in conditions of despair. Refugee camps, war zones, and impoverished suburbs became breeding grounds for recruits. Bin Laden's propaganda, as detailed in the previous chapter, played a decisive role, offering a narrative of redemption, sacrifice, and cosmic struggle. Disaffected youth, alienated from societies that offered little hope, found purpose in his cause. The internet amplified recruitment, bypassing physical barriers and enabling real-time radicalization. The profile of a bin Laden follower was broad. University students, street militants, religious clerics, and even former soldiers. While motivated by various factors, faith, revenge, adventure, what united them was a sense of mission in a world perceived as unjust and corrupt. Bin Laden's network orchestrated elaborate vetting processes, ensuring that operatives were both committed and capable. Training camps served as crucibles for new leaders, each instructed in ideology, tactics, and secrecy. The spread of al-Qaeda's reach was also marked by shifting allegiances. Some affiliates developed autonomy, launching operations independent of central command. Others splintered over doctrinal disputes or resource scarcity. Notable among these was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually evolved into its own entity, foreshadowing larger schisms in jihadist ranks. The challenge for bin Laden was enforcing unity amid the centrifugal forces of ambition and circumstance. Intelligence agencies and governments scrambled to keep pace. Counterterrorism strategies evolved, incorporating surveillance, infiltration, and capacity building in vulnerable regions. Yet the decentralized nature of al-Qaeda made eradication difficult. Each cell operated with varying autonomy. Defeat in one area led to resurgence elsewhere. Bin Laden had designed a network where martyrdom and loss fueled further. Recruitment, a cycle that became self-perpetuating. Followers and fanatics of al-Qaeda shaped the trajectory of international terrorism. Their reach extended into the mundane, airports, buses, markets, creating pervasive insecurity. Governments enacted far-reaching security measures, transforming societies in the process. Civil liberties were often sacrificed, racial profiling increased, and social cohesion eroded. Despite bin Laden's eventual demise, the legacy of his mobilization persists. Offshoots, splinters, and new movements continue to exploit the models he perfected. Decentralized cells, viral propaganda, and ideological rigor. The phenomena of homegrown radicalization, lone wolf attacks, and transnational support networks are direct outgrowths of the architecture he built. Bin Laden's followers were not just pawns. They became architects of their own terror. As al-Qaeda's reach spread, so too did the methods and motivations for violence. The contagion of fanaticism, ignited by one man's vision, continues to shape the world in ways both seen and hidden. Chapter 15. Rivalries in Terror. From al-Qaeda to ISIS. The evolution of modern terrorism cannot be understood without tracing the intricate rivalries that emerged in the wake of bin Laden's dominance. While al-Qaeda laid the groundwork, the rise of ISIS signaled a new era of extremism, one that both competed with and diverged from bin Laden's original vision. Al-Qaeda, under bin Laden's stewardship, was global in scope yet methodical in execution. Its attacks were planned with precision, aimed at symbolic targets, embassies, military installations, and infamously, the World Trade Center. The organization sought legitimacy among Islamist circles, positioning itself as the vanguard of Jihad against Western powers. Bin Laden imposed careful selection of targets, wary of alienating potential supporters through indiscriminate violence. This caution, however, was not universally shared. In the aftermath of the Iraq War, al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, rose as a force marked by brutality and sectarian violence. AQI's tactics included mass casualty bombings, kidnapping, and graphic executions, tactics that alarmed even al-Qaeda's senior leadership. These differences exposed deep fissures within the movement. AQI's zeal for indiscriminate killing risked undermining bin Laden's strategic goals. After Zarqawi's death, the remnants of AQI would evolve, ultimately transforming into the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS. ISIS distinguished itself by seizing territory, declaring a caliphate, and embracing digital propaganda. Unlike al-Qaeda, which operated through cells, ISIS governed cities, controlled resources, and drew foreign fighters through sophisticated recruitment videos. Their brutality and theatrical violence, beheadings, mass killings, destruction of heritage sites were intended to shock and polarize. Rivalry between al-Qaeda and ISIS intensified as ISIS's success overshadowed al-Qaeda's legacy. Ideological schisms widened. Al-Qaeda maintained global jihad as its mission, while ISIS emphasized the establishment of a political entity. The two organizations competed for recruits, resources, and ideological primacy. Each denounced the other, with bin Laden's heirs condemning ISIS for recklessness and deviation from Islamic jurisprudence. This competition had far-reaching consequences. The fragmentation of the jihadist movement complicated counter-terrorism efforts. Where al-Qaeda was centralized but discreet, ISIS thrived on spectacle and immediacy. Governments faced new challenges, confronting an enemy that openly governed territory and inspired attacks through remote control. Intelligence agencies grappled with the speed and adaptability of ISIS's network, especially its use of social media to radicalize and direct followers. The rivalry also had profound effects on affiliated groups. Organizations in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia split along lines of loyalty. Some pledged allegiance to ISIS, others remained with al-Qaeda, precipitating local conflicts and new waves of violence. The escalation of brutality, from suicide bombings to mass executions, set a higher threshold for terror, increasing public fear and complicating diplomatic responses. Bin Laden's death did not end the story. It began a new chapter in the arms race of terror. The competition between al-Qaeda and ISIS reshaped recruitment, financing, and tactics. Each organization sought to outdo the other, whether through more audacious attacks, larger followings, or the establishment of new fronts. The repercussions extend into contemporary politics. Conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and beyond have become laboratories for rivalry. Refugee flows, sectarian strife, and splinter movements are direct byproducts of the schism. Even as ISIS's territorial ambitions suffered setbacks, its ideology persists, radicalizing individuals globally, perpetuating a cycle that bin Laden himself presaged, but could not control as the history of terror unfolds. The rivalry between al-Qaeda and ISIS remains a central axis, a contest for influence, legitimacy, and survival. The legacy of bin Laden is not static. It is transformed, challenged, and reinterpreted by every new actor who claims his mantle. Chapter 16, Manhunt, the CIA Intelligence and Global Pursuit. The hunt for Osama bin Laden stands as one of the most complex intelligence operations in modern history. Few fugitives have so completely captured the attention and resources of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies. The story of the manhunt is an intricate web of espionage, technology, and human determination, spanning continents and involving myriad agencies, each with its own methods, limitations, and breakthroughs. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the United States shifted its entire national security apparatus toward finding the mastermind. President George W. Bush made it clear in his addresses, bringing bin Laden to justice was not only a question of retribution. It was imperative to demonstrate American resolve and dismantle the operational core of al-Qaeda. At the forefront was the CIA, operating both as a shadow player and a field operator. Early intelligence efforts focused on traditional forms of signals intelligence, SIGINT, intercepting communications between known terrorists, monitoring satellite traffic, and attempting to trace bin Laden's movements using electronic means. However, al-Qaeda quickly learned to evade digital surveillance, forcing agencies to adapt by relying increasingly on human intelligence, HUMINT. Allied intelligence agencies, especially Pakistan's ISI, Britain's MI6, and the Saudi General Intelligence Presidency contributed to the coalition. Informants were cultivated, defectors debriefed, and family networks meticulously mapped. Many leads evaporated as quickly as they appeared. Bin Laden's formidable operational security meant that he moved rarely, never used phones, and trusted only an inner circle, often extended family or loyal lieutenants. The now infamous Tora Bora cave complex in Afghanistan represented one of the biggest missed opportunities. U.S. Special Forces narrowly missed capturing bin Laden by mere hours, as he disappeared into the rugged mountains that became his shield. As time passed, the manhunt became a global game of cat and mouse. Intelligence officials learned to follow the money, tracking obscure financial transactions, donations to charities with questionable links, and the quiet channels used to move resources across borders. Efforts expanded to include biometric data, satellite imaging reconnaissance, and the recruitment of double agents. Internally, the CIA formed special units like Alex Station, tasked with the singular purpose of capturing or killing bin Laden. Drone technology became a staple of surveillance in Pakistan's tribal areas. Analysts spent thousands of hours poring over intercepted messages, videos, and the few communiques released by bin Laden himself. The broader international pursuit was often fraught with political complexity. The sovereignty of nations like Pakistan posed unique challenges. Sensitive intelligence had to be balanced with the need for secrecy, as any leak could alert bin Laden or his protectors. For more than a decade, bin Laden was more shadow than substance. Sightings were rare, rumors plentiful, and each dead end forced investigators to re-examine assumptions and start from scratch. It became clear that his survival depended not only on physical evasion, but on the mythos he had cultivated. A leader who could disappear, outwit, and endure in the face of the world's greatest powers. By 2010, however, a single thread, a trusted courier, emerged. Patient, methodical intelligence work followed this courier through northern Pakistan, finally leading to an unremarkable compound in Abbottabad. The finish line was in sight, and the relentless pursuit was about to culminate in one of the most famous raids in intelligence history. Chapter 17, Abbottabad, the final hideout. Abbottabad, a city known more for its tranquil mountain views and military academy than for international intrigue, would become the world's most scrutinized address. For nearly 5 years, Osama bin Laden lived a life of calculated seclusion within the walls of an unusually fortified compound, hidden in plain sight near the Pakistan Military Academy. The compound itself was a maze of high walls, barbed wire and tightly controlled access points. Its unconventional features, such as few windows, extensive perimeter fencing, and its size compared to surrounding homes, eventually caught the eye of U.S. intelligence analysts. Yet for the people living nearby, the residents of the compound maintained a low profile. Shopping trips were infrequent and made by trusted couriers. Children played within the walls, never outside. No phone lines or internet connections betrayed the presence of the world's most wanted man. Inside, bin Laden lived with multiple family members. To maintain operational security, the family led a regimented life, recycling water, burning trash inside the walls to prevent trace evidence, and remaining vigilant against every outsider's glance. The compound was designed for privacy and escape, though ultimately it proved to be a trap as much as a sanctuary. Despite the distance from Afghanistan's lawless border regions, Abbottabad offered strategic advantages. It was a city filled with military and retired officials. The presence of the Pakistan Military Academy added a layer of camouflage. Who would suspect the world's most infamous terrorist to seek shelter under the nose of Pakistan's military establishment? The CIA's discovery of the compound was a triumph of patience and persistence. Tracking the courier, nicknamed Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, led analysts to observe odd routines. A man with no visible job who lived in a high-security house, whose residents never seemed to leave or receive visitors. Surveillance posts were established to gather photographic evidence and behavioral patterns. Inside those walls, bin Laden worked to stay relevant, writing letters to his followers, overseeing the messaging of al-Qaeda, and attempting to manage a decentralized, increasingly fractured terror network. The isolation wore heavily, Gone were the days of mountain encampments and direct command. Now, his influence was filtered through guarded messages and intermittently smuggled courier dispatches. Neighbors speculated but dared not pry. Pakistani authorities either remained oblivious or chose willful ignorance. Some intelligence analysts believe the compound's location was chosen specifically because of its seemingly implausible proximity to military oversight, betting that the most obvious hiding place would, paradoxically, be the safest. The compound stood as a testament to bin Laden's resources, adaptability, and singular mission to survive, evade, and inspire. Yet the very secrecy that kept him hidden nearly destroyed his organization's ability to function in the modern, connected world. In his final years, bin Laden increasingly resembled a ghost haunting global consciousness, but physically imprisoned by his own caution and notoriety. As the noose tightened and intelligence grew irrefutable, the compound's days were numbered. The stage in Abbottabad was set not just for bin Laden's final stand, but for a moment of global historical reckoning, one that would unfold in the dead of night, far from the world's gaze. Chapter 18, Operation Neptune Spear, The Death of bin Laden. In the late evening of May 1, 2011, as darkness enveloped Abbottabad, a squadron of elite U.S. Navy SEALs lifted off from Afghanistan under the codename Operation Neptune Spear. It was the culmination of years of intelligence work, months of preparation, and days of tense final briefings. The mission objective was clear but unprecedented: capture or kill Osama bin Laden. The final decision, made by President Barack Obama after exhaustive debate, took into account the risks of violating Pakistani sovereignty, the possibility of failure, and the historical weight of the outcome. The operation would rely on stealth helicopters, state-of-the-art night vision, and a playbook honed by years of counter-terror raids. As the helicopters crossed into Pakistani airspace, the world was unaware of the history about to unfold. The SEALs' approach was not without incident. One helicopter crash landed inside the compound due to turbulence and the high surrounding walls. Undeterred, the SEALs pressed forward. Their training prepared them for such variables. Contingency plans were enacted with disciplined precision. The assault lasted mere minutes. Methodically, the SEALs breached barriers, neutralized threats, and made their way to the upper levels of the compound, where bin Laden was believed to be hiding. The operation's intensity was matched by its care, identifying inhabitants, avoiding unnecessary civilian casualties, and collecting intelligence material. In a matter of moments, bin Laden was located. According to official accounts, he was unarmed but refused to surrender, using one of his wives as a shield. With little hesitation, he was shot and killed. The SEALs confirmed the identity of the body, using both facial recognition and DNA analysis, before collecting a trove of evidence: hard drives, documents, and personal diaries. In less than 40 minutes, the most wanted terrorist in the world was dead. The SEALs exfiltrated with bin Laden's body, destroying their downed helicopter to leave nothing behind. Back in the United States, President Obama addressed the nation announcing, "Justice has been done." The news reverberated globally. Celebrations erupted in New York, Washington, and around the world, while governments everywhere scrambled to brace for possible reprisals. Operation Neptune Spear represented both an operational triumph and a delicate dance of diplomacy. Pakistan, caught unaware, protested the unilateral breach of its territory. The global intelligence community dissected every detail for lessons learned. The raid was meticulously planned, with satellite overflights, full-scale compound mock-ups for SEAL training, and every contingency considered. The mission's secrecy was paramount. Only a handful of individuals in the U.S. administration knew the full details before the strike was executed. Perhaps most importantly, the raid symbolized more than the death of a mastermind. It was seen by many as a turning point, a moment of justice for the victims of terror, and a statement of American resolve. Yet as the dust settled and the celebrations faded, it was evident that the ideological battle was far from over. Bin Laden was dead, but the forces he unleashed remained dangerously alive. Chapter 19. Legacy of Violence. The Ongoing War on Terror. The death of Osama bin Laden did not bring an end to terrorism, nor did it signify the dissolution of al-Qaeda. If anything, his killing catalyzed new forms of extremism, spurred offshoot groups and forced global powers to reassess their strategies in the ongoing war on terror. Bin Laden had designed al-Qaeda to operate as a decentralized network. His physical absence did not necessarily dismantle its operational capability. Leadership quickly passed to Ayman al-Zawahiri, and affiliates in Yemen, Somalia, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula adapted to the new reality. The death of their symbolic leader was both a blow and a rallying cry, causing both disruption and renewed fanaticism within jihadist circles. The US-led war in Afghanistan, which began as a direct response to 9/11, slogged on for years. Terror tactics evolved. Suicide bombings, improvised explosive devices, and lone wolf attacks proliferated globally. The wars in Iraq and Syria, the rise of ISIS, and renewed threats in previously stable regions marked a new, more unpredictable era. Western intelligence agencies, facing dynamic threats, shifted from focusing solely on al-Qaeda to combating a wide constellation of radical groups and ideologies. Domestic security measures expanded dramatically. Airport screenings, surveillance, anti-radicalization programs, often sparking heated debates about civil liberties, privacy, and the balance between security and freedom. The legacy of violence was not only external. Societies became more polarized. Political discourse, once built on optimism and openness, was increasingly marred by suspicion, xenophobia, and divisive rhetoric. Bin Laden's attacks had succeeded, in part, in reshaping not only policies, but the very psyche of modern society. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda and its offshoots adapted their narratives to inspire homegrown terror. The internet became their new battlefield. Online propaganda, encrypted communications, and global digital reach allowed new recruits to be radicalized from thousands of miles away, rendering borders and conventional defenses less effective. In the shadow of bin Laden, the war on terror became perpetual. No single victory, not even the assassination of its architect, could deliver closure. New faces, new threats, and new motivations emerged, often tracing their ideological lineage to the same grievances and dogmas that fueled bin Laden's vision. The world, in response, built new alliances, undertook surveillance on an unprecedented scale, and redefined military engagement for a digital age. The legacy of violence was not only about the tactics used, but the atmosphere created, one of vigilance, anxiety, and unresolved conflict. It is in this context that the fight against terrorism endures. The ghost of bin Laden lingers, not in a body or a name, but in the mutated ambitions of those he inspired and the relentless preparation of those sworn to oppose them. Chapter 20. Lessons from Terror. Understanding Extremism in the Modern World. The saga of Osama bin Laden gives vital insight into the dynamics of extremism in the contemporary age. To frame the modern struggle against terror, it is critical to understand the roots of radicalization, the allure of extremist narratives, and the failures and successes of global counterterrorism efforts. At the heart of extremism lies an ideology, a potent blend of grievance, utopian vision, and perceived injustice. For bin Laden, the narrative was clear. The West, led by the United States, was responsible for the suffering of Muslims worldwide, and only through violent jihad could true justice be achieved. This black and white worldview, though rejected by the vast majority of Muslims, found resonance in isolated, disenfranchised communities where political and economic failure bred resentment. The global spread of al-Qaeda's message was propelled by its adaptability. Unlike the rigid authoritarianism of 20th century terror groups, al-Qaeda relied on flexible franchises and shared ideology more than strict directives. This model allowed for local adaptation, unpredictable strategies, and resilience. Even as the original leadership was shattered, the movement endured. Counterterrorism has relied heavily on military and intelligence solutions, drone strikes, commando raids, enhanced surveillance. Yet these efforts, while occasionally successful in eliminating high-profile targets, often failed to address the underlying causes: lack of opportunity, unresolved grievances, and the identity crises that fuel radicalization. So ironically, some counter-terror policies, particularly those perceived as heavy-handed or indiscriminate, served to reinforce extremist narratives. Prison abuses, civilian casualties, and perceived occupations provided grist for terrorist propaganda, helping to recruit and radicalize new adherents. A more nuanced approach has slowly emerged. Governments, NGOs, and community leaders increasingly focus on soft power strategies, disrupting extremist recruitment through education, economic opportunity, and robust community engagement. Programs in Europe, Southeast Asia, and North Africa aim to rehabilitate former jihadists, counter online propaganda, and provide alternative paths for at-risk individuals. Social media and technology have proven to be double-edged swords. While terrorists have exploited these platforms for recruitment and communication, they have also enabled counter-messaging and rapid detection efforts. The lessons from bin Laden's era are clear. Extremism is adaptive, often thriving at the periphery of failed states and fractured societies. Lasting security rests not just on vigilance, but on efforts to build inclusive societies that address the deep-rooted drivers of violence. Bin Laden's legacy is thus not only one of tragedy and horror, but of enduring instruction, warning that only a global, multifaceted approach can hope to diminish the shadow of terror he once cast so darkly across the world. If you found this video helpful, inspiring, or entertaining, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on future content. Your support means the world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.